So, what happens when an engineer, someone who literally lives by data and evidence, decides to treat the question of God like a professional research project? Well, we're going to dive into the story of one man's incredible intellectual journey from being a complete skeptic all the way to the edge of belief.
This quote, it just says it all, right? This is where our engineer started. He wasn't just on the fence, he was a convinced materialist. For him, God, Jesus, all of it, that was just like Santa Claus. You know, childhood stories you're supposed to grow out of. The case was closed.
But then a personal crisis kind of forced his hand. See, his wife had a deep faith, and that difference between them was becoming a real problem in their marriage. So with his relationship on the line, he felt like he had to find the real truth. And so, for the very first time in his life, he launched a full-blown research project into it all, from a purely intellectual angle.
And let me be clear, this was not going to be some casual Google search. This guy was a professional researcher. He was going to approach this with the exact same rigor he'd use for any project at work. Define the questions, look at the evidence, and just follow the data, wherever it took him.
His starting hypothesis was actually pretty simple. He figured that all religious belief was just a cultural artifact. Basically, you believe what you believe because of where you grew up. In his mind, it was just dogma with no real intellectual backbone, a box he thought he'd climbed out of a long, long time ago.
So, the investigation kicked off with the most fundamental question he could possibly think of, and it was a question that was going to challenge the very foundation of his entire worldview.
And that question was this: are we just our brains? Is there anything more to a human being than the physical gray matter between our ears? Is our consciousness just some kind of illusion created by a complex computer made of meat? Or could there be something else going on, something non-material?
And you can see that shift in his thinking right here. He started completely on the left, totally convinced that we're just our brains, end of story. But his own research started forcing him to seriously, genuinely consider the idea on the right, that maybe, just maybe, there's a mind or a soul that's actually separate from the brain.
What's really interesting here is the quality of the evidence he was looking at. I mean, we're not talking about random YouTube videos. He was digging into serious academic studies, like the research on near-death experiences coming out of the University of Virginia, and even analyzing a philosophy symposium on the topic from UC San Diego.
And that symposium, wow, that was a huge turning point. After looking at all these verified accounts of near-death experiences that they just couldn't explain away, the philosophers there basically said this. They admitted the evidence stumped them, but they just flat out refused to even consider a non-material explanation.
Now, to him, as a scientist, that reaction was it was profound intellectual corruption. The whole point of science is to follow the evidence, right? Not to decide what answers are off limits before you even start. They just weren't willing to step outside their materialist box, and to him, that felt like a total betrayal of the scientific mindset.
So, at this point, he's concluded we are likely more than just our physical brains. He was no longer a materialist. And that opened up a whole new can of worms, which kicked off the second major phase of his research, actually looking into the possibility of a creator.
His second research question was really the only logical next step. If a non-material reality is real, then how did it all get here? What's the best explanation for a universe that has consciousness in it in the first place?
So he started digging into those classic arguments for God's existence. He looked at things like the Theism Cosmological argument, the idea that since the universe had a beginning, something must have caused it. And he looked at the mind-boggling fine-tuning of the universe, how all these physical constants are set just perfectly to allow for life. He even dove into the work of philosophers like William Lane Craig, who live and breathe this stuff.
And get this, one of the most compelling things he found actually came from an atheist philosopher at NYU. This guy said the gorilla in the room is the creation seems to have a purpose. And that purpose seems to be us, human intelligence. He actually argued that suggesting this all happened by random chance is, at this point, a ludicrous proposition.
So after weighing all this evidence, all the cosmology and philosophy, he reached a conclusion. Now, he wasn't 100% certain, but he was convinced enough that, as he put it, if he were a betting man in Vegas, he would put his money on there being a creator. The odds for him had totally shifted.
All right, so he's gone from a staunch materialist to believing in a creator. The final step in his intellectual project was to zoom way in and investigate the really specific claims of Christianity, especially its most unbelievable, central claim.
He tackled this by using what's called the minimal facts argument. Now, this method is really smart.
It only focuses on historical data that is so strong, a huge majority of New Testament scholars, including the skeptics and atheists, actually accept them as fact. Things like the crucifixion, the fact that the disciples genuinely believed they saw Jesus alive again, and the insane transformations of skeptics like his own brother James and a persecutor like Paul.
But here's the thing. Even after all of this, after concluding a creator probably exists, and that the historical case for Christianity was way stronger than he thought, he just hit a wall. His intellectual journey could only take him so far.
Because even with all the evidence, the idea of a literal resurrection, a man coming back from the dead, it still just seemed ludicrous to him. He might bet on a creator in Vegas, sure, but he admitted he would not have bet his life on this. His intellectual case had just reached its limit.
Then he remembered some advice he'd gotten, that intellectual arguments can only get you to the doorstep. To really know, you have to actually ask. So one Saturday morning, feeling like he had nothing to lose, he decided to try. And his first thought was literally, this is the silliest thing I've ever done.
I mean, he honestly felt like he was praying to Santa Claus. But he'd exhausted every single other intellectual road. So, with a sincere heart, he decided to conduct one final experiment. He decided to pray.
And it wasn't some rehearsed, flowery prayer. It was raw. It was honest. It was a challenge, really. The culmination of his entire massive research project. He just said, if you're there, you need to show me you're there. Otherwise, I'm going to die an atheist, and I mean that. And that is where his research report ends. He laid out all the data, followed it as far as his mind could possibly take him, and then he took a step beyond the evidence. Which leaves all of us with a really fascinating question to think about. Where exactly does an intellectual journey end and a personal one begin?